This P-47 and this A-20 are just two of the Lewis Air Legends airplanes. Rod Lewis has 24 legendary aircraft in his collection, mostly warbirds, and each one has stories to tell that could fascinate us through the day and on into the night. Rod is committed to maintaining and sharing the history of these airplanes and their roles in protecting our country. Those stories and about the pilots who flew these planes are coming up. And speaking of pilots, there are pilots, there are really good pilots, and then once in a while a pilot comes along who is so extraordinary, both as a pilot and as a person in the air and on the ground, that it's impossible to adequately describe that person. There is a man who fits that description.
Oh, I see you spotted the name on the plane. Bob Hoover. He used to be a test pilot, one of the best. Today he's manager of customer relations for North American's Los Angeles division, and he's the man who demonstrates this plane. Well, here he comes now. You know, he flies this plane in a business suit and without a parachute. Hi, Bob. We've just been admiring this beauty of yours.
Beauty she is, and she flies like a dream. Tell you what, folks, climb in with me now, and let's see what we can do.
In the air, in World War II, he fought to save our country from those who would try to take away our freedoms. On the ground, he has committed himself to our country's values and has always reflected those values in his own daily life so that we never forget who we are as Americans and how so many have given their lives to keep America safe and free. He soloed at 16, but then had to teach himself aerobatics to overcome air sickness. A few years later, in Air Corps primary pilot training, he was so good at aerobatics that his commander had him teach all of his instructors aerobatics. He flew combat in Europe, was taken prisoner in Germany. He escaped and commandeered a German Focke-Wulf 190 and flew it to Holland. After the war, as a test pilot, he flew hundreds of different models of airplanes. One flight, October 14, 1947, he flew chase on the Bell XS-1. That was man's first successful supersonic flight when the pilot lived to tell about it. Yes, he took that famous photo of the bullet-shaped rocket plane breaking the sound barrier. And who can ever forget the first time they saw Bob fly his Mustang and Shrike Commander in air shows around the world? Jimmy Doolittle introduced him as the greatest stick and rudder pilot who ever lived. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Bob Hoover. On April 2nd this year at Uberhadzi of Smithsonian Air and Space, the second bronze life-size statue of an aviator was unveiled at Uberhadzi, and it was of Bob Hoover. The first and the only other life-size statue at Smithsonian is Billy Mitchell. So Bob is in rare company, and so is Billy Mitchell. Bob, good morning.
My dear friend, what a treat to be with you.
And what a treat to be with you again as well. Good morning. Bob, what does that mean to you? When we were there that night at Uberhazy in April, and to have that statue of you, and you've already got your two airplanes there, the Aero Commander and the Mustang, are in the museum. What do those honors mean to you coming from Smithsonian and the aviation community?
Well, the truth of the matter is, there are far more people that deserve this than I ever was capable of receiving it. But I am tickled to death because so many people believed in what I did and why I did it, and they donated an enormous amount of money, and I guess it got into the real big dollars, and all of the money over and above the cost of the statue went to the museum. And I've done a lot of those kind of things that I'm really proud of, and if you don't mind my bragging a little bit, I made $1,013,000 out of one movie at the premiere only, and the people who invested in the movie said, Bob, we made that donation and it's your money. What do you want to do with it? I said, I want to put it into aviation, and I donated the money to the Embry-Riddle Air College and for scholarships, and I've now had some classes graduating, and I'm very proud of it.
Bob, Thingy, here we are to honor every year for a week honoring veterans. We have over 2 million veterans now in the United States, American veterans. When you think about our veterans today, what goes through your mind?
Well, I can respond to that easily. I have some very dear friends. I don't know how many of you know Mike Herman, but he is a very dear close friend of mine, and he uses his private business jet every weekend that he can. He goes to a Veterans Administration hospital and finds some wounded soldier from one of our war days, and he says, when was the last time you saw your family? And the young man will say, it's been a very long time. I don't have the money, or I'm too crippled to go visit him, or I can't get to see my family. He flies them from wherever they live, or the veteran takes him to his home, goes back and picks him up 3 days later, after, say on Sunday, and brings him back to the hospital. He has organized other people who have a private business jet and do just exactly what Mike has done, and I think he ought to get a big recognition.
Mike Herman.
Let's give it to him.
And Mike, by the way, is the gentleman who came
Mike Herman.
Mike came out with us just a few minutes ago. Bob, as many times as we've spoken and we've heard stories, and most of the people here know a lot of the stories about your career, but there are certain little details that sometimes get missed. And if you would, let me take you to a couple of those stories and try to recall some of the details. You heard in the video ahead about the fact, Bob was shot down. He was 16 months a prisoner of war in Stalag 1 in northern Germany. He escaped. There was a recently deserted German airfield. He was able to get in a Focke-Wulf 190 and flew it with German markings, mind you, of course, across Germany to land in Holland. You landed in Holland in a field. Bob, how is it that you didn't get shot when you landed in Holland flying a German airplane?
Well, really had a problem. Germany, when they retreated all across North Africa, when we would take over an airfield, we couldn't land on it, beautiful runway, because the Germans, when they deserted after we were pushing them back, they would put landmines in the runway. And when our forces came in, and we didn't have to do that but about once or twice, and we decided we don't land on an airfield that we have recovered from the Germans. And on my escape, I got to just back up and say, it was the dumbest thing anybody ever did. The war was 2 weeks from being over. The Germans were deserting, and I was so in the mind of escaping, and I had done nothing but try to escape from the day they got me. And I could talk to you for hours about the things I did and experienced. And to sum it all up, I was beaten up on many occasions for my attempts at escape when they recaptured me. And I never gave up going for it. And I got my inspiration from a colonel who was shot down before me. And he had heard from, he was a wonderful fighter pilot.
Russ Spicer?
Russ Spicer, one of the finest people you've ever met. And Russ was captured. He was rescued. He was shot down in a P-47, as a matter of fact. And he landed in the water, got in his life raft. It was the winter time on the Baltic Sea, and by the time they recovered him, he had gotten up on the beach, and he was found unconscious by the Germans. And they brought him into our prison camp, and he stood up and said, "Gentlemen, General Patton, I've just learned, has gone out in front of all of his supply supports." And he had I think it was almost 1,000 men. And the Germans realized that Patton had outrun his supply forces for ammunition, everything. He was so far ahead of the troops coming in. And the Germans got smart, and they put a pincer and closed him in. So 1,000 men were right there captured. And the Germans came in and shot every one of them. 2 of the people survived. And they were received, they recovered enough to where they brought them into the same hospital I ended up in a prison camp, and I had a chance to visit with him.
How much of an inspiration was Colonel Spicer to you?
He was, he was like Jesus to me, like somebody I wouldn't even talk to. I was only a flight officer. But when he made his speech and said what had happened, he said, "Remember, these are your enemy. I don't want to see a single person in this prison camp being friendly with the Germans or trying to be friendly." He said, "Just remember, they're your enemy." And boy, I was motivated by him. He was a leader, if there ever was one.
And even though General Eisenhower had spread the word, "Don't try to escape now, we're going to get you out here within a couple of weeks," but you did it anyway.
Yeah. But every time I would get into, I had to go with solitary confinement for trying to escape, and you don't have any daylight. You don't know what day it is or anything. I ended up in the cell next to to him. And he not when we knew when the Germans were coming because we were on wooden planks in front of our cells, and you could hear them clanking. And so he would wait until the sounds were coming down, and he'd knock on the door and say, "Who's my neighbor?" And I told him I was a flight officer. And he said, "Well, young man, what did you do to get in here?" And I said, "Well, I attempted to escape again." And he said, "I want you to know you're one of my heroes." And he said, "When we get out of here, I'll never forget you." And every day he didn't know whether he was going to live or die because they were going to put him before the firing squad. And one of the great heroes in my life. And well, you know of him and heard of him, so he was a wonderful individual.
So you got in the ME-109, you got off, again with German markings, and you flew across Germany to Holland. How did you know you were in Holland?
Well, first of all, we went in to we were starving to death. And we went into a farmhouse, I knocked on the door, and a lady answered the phone. And I asked her if she spoke English, and she said, meaning a little bit. And so we tried to talk to her, and I told her we were escaped prisoners, and we were starving to death, and if she could give us something to eat, well, I'd like to leave a message that she had helped us. And so I wrote a note. She gave me some paper and a pencil, and I left a note saying that she had been helping us on our escape. And of course we hadn't eaten eggs in a long, long time. That was really the first great breakfast I ever had. But she didn't read the note out of it. And so after she fed us, I shook hands and thanked her. And my fellow that escaped with me, we hit the road. And we were walking down this dirt road that came out to this farmhouse. And she came out and she was holding the letter, the little note that I'd written with a pencil. And she was running and yelling, and I thought, oh my heavens, what's happened to the lady? And I ran back to meet her, and she had a pistol in her hand and cartridges. And she said, I just read the letter in broken English. She could speak to her. And I had said, she said to me, this will do you more good, I'm sure, than it will me. And she gave me the pistol and a whole bunch of cartridges to go with it for the bullets. Well, boy, we were in Fat City. We got at bicycles now. So we stole the bicycle. And we rode a lot of miles on those bicycles. But we had that gun for security for ourselves. And
so did you have reason to use the gun when you got to the airfield?
I did. We finally came to an airfield, and it was deserted. But there were still people there. But compared to where it really would have been a few weeks earlier. And airplanes were in revetments. And for those of you who are not familiar with revetments, that is a U-shaped buildup of rocks or anything like this. And they park airplanes in them. And it's open at one end. And over the top they have something like a tent structure, but it looks like trees from the air. And so that's what we did, as well as the Germans. We hid our airplanes under those kind of situations at airfields, and they're not seen by the reconnaissance airplanes that come over and find out how many enemy airplanes you got on a different airfield. It's hard to know, you couldn't tell. And so I went from revetment to revetment, because the Germans had deserted so much that there were only a few of them walking around. And I saw the one come around, and I told my friend, whose name was Jerry Ennis, that I escaped with, I said, I'm going to put the gun on the next mechanic that comes by. I could tell by the attire he had on, mechanic, sir. And I motioned him into the hangar with the gun like this. And he came over to the hangar, and we couldn't communicate. And my friend Jerry said, Bob, he said, I taught French in high school before I joined the service. I'm going to see if he can speak French. We clicked, and he spoke French. And he told the German, he said, I'm going to shoot you if you don't have Bob start the airplane. Well, the Focke-Wulf 190 was not foreign to me because Gus Lundquist, another friend of mine, who was a test pilot at Wright Field, was sent over to England to check out in all of the captured German airplanes that the British had. And he talked the general into letting him fly one mission because he wanted to fight, but he was stuck as a test pilot at Wright Field. He'd checked out in all of these airplanes and just spent 10 hours flying a Focke-Wulf 190. And I found out that he'd been at Wright Field where I wanted to go after the war. And I went over and started visiting with him. He didn't want anybody to know that he was from Wright Field or what he'd done or anything. And it didn't get out to many people hardly at all. But he revealed to me that that's where he was stationed. And I said, there's that Focke-Wulf airfield right near here. And we would see them fly over, and I said, I would sure like to know how to start that engine. And he said, well, I'll draw you pictures. And we'd get out in the dirt after we'd be counted every day, and he would sketch off where the instrument panel was, everything. Well, 8 months later, when I got out, I got in that 190 and I looked at everything, and I thought, gee whiz, I'm in a world of trouble. And I said, Jerry, we got to figure out some way to, the man that he put the gun I had brought into the rabbit, he told him, he says, if you don't get that engine started and get him off the ground, you're dead. And boy, this guy started shaking, and boy, he turned pale white. And I got in the cockpit, and he helped me. And I thought I knew something about it, but it's been so long since Gus had checked me out. I didn't do anything. I just checked the engine, ran it up. I knew it was okay. It had a lot of bullet holes in it, but it was full of gas, so I knew that it was flyable.
So you didn't have a parachute? You didn't have a cushion?
I had nothing. And
Did you see over the? Did you see over the?
No, the problem was, this is the funniest thing. I didn't have a cushion. I didn't have a parachute. And so when I got in, I'm now, instead of sitting up like this, I'm now sitting here like this, looking out. And he got it started, and I thought, boy, there's still guys up in those gunnery sites around the field. I'm not going to taxi out. So I just ran the engine up until I got full power, released the brakes, straight out, and up as steep as I could get. And I thought, you are the dumbest aviator that ever flew. The war's almost over, and you idiot, you're trying to go in an airplane. What the hell are you accomplishing? And the answer's nothing. And so, I was not proud of it, I don't mind telling you. And then I thought, boy, any young second lieutenant right out of flight training could have shot me right out of the sky. And I wouldn't have defended myself no matter what. And fortunately, there was a cloud deck at about 4,000 feet. And I sort of got up to the edge of the cloud and level and stayed there. And I thought, if I see any American airplanes, I'll just drop up into the clouds and then wait a few minutes until maybe they quit looking and dive out and try to get free. I never had a problem. I never saw another airplane. But I went over many airfields, had full tanks of fuel, and I was headed for Holland because I wanted to see windmills to be sure that I was in favorable country. And they were on our side. I saw the windmills and I couldn't find any place to land. But I had an open field. My gas tank was registered close to zero, and I thought I better get it on the ground while I've got control. And so I circled the good place. It looked like it was a pretty good field. So I put the gear down and landed. And when I got on the ground, I could see a ditch that I had not seen from the air. And I was headed right for it. And I could picture myself hitting the ditch, flipping upside down, being trapped there, and nobody'd ever find me. Well, I ground moved. I just reached down and sucked up the gear, booted full rudder, and it skidded to a stop on its belly. And I sat there, nobody anywhere, and I thought, you are no question the dumbest pilot that ever lived. And so I sat there for a few minutes and said, what the heck are you going to do now? Well, I got out and didn't have to carry anything because I didn't have anything. And I headed for some trees because I had seen a little dirt road on the other side. And I went into the trees and I was wondering, what if I was heading in the right direction. And all of a sudden pitchforks came at me from every direction. And they were all Dutchmen who had seen me land in the German airplane with swastikas on it. And they hated the Germans like you couldn't believe. And boy, they had pitchforks. And I put my hands up and kept pointing like that, and yelling, American, American. Nobody could understand me. And we got on the other side of the trees, and I still had my hands up, and there's some dirt road there. And the good Lord helped out a truck from the British truck came by, and it had two men in it, and I was still holding my hands up, and I was waving them like that, and the vehicle stopped, and I said, I hope you can help me. I'm a Yank, and they think I'm a Kraut because I just left a German airplane over there in that field on the other side of the tree. They say, I see, old chip, pop in. Anyway, that's not a horror story. It's a stupid story. And for a year and a half, or maybe 2 years, I wouldn't tell that story to anybody in the world. I was so embarrassed, and I felt so stupid about it. But all of a sudden, everybody tried to act like I'd done something great. I didn't do anything great. I did something very stupid. But my friend came to an air show, and he had read about it in the paper. And something with the little people keeps people out of the crowd away from the airfield. Came over and he said, Mr. Hoover, this man over there said he was in prison camp with you. And my narrator, who flew one of my airplanes from one place to the other, he said, God, Bob, there must have been 100,000 people in that prison camp. Every time we go to any air show, somebody comes out and says, he was there. And I said, well, started out with 1,000 and ended up with 10,000 prisoners. And I got to be known by a lot of people, but he said, it looks like to me you must have been with 10,000 of people. That wasn't the case. But they wanted to interview him. And before I could shut him up, he started telling the story. And suddenly my embarrassment was coming out in front of the whole world. It's been there ever since. And I was no hero. I didn't do anything but be stupid. That's all there is to it.
P-47, this airplane behind you. Any memories of the P-47?
I've got some wonderful things to tell you. When I was one of those chosen to be the test pilot, the #1 test pilot on the Bell X-1 first rocket ship, and my friend Chuck Yeager was a maintenance officer in the flight test, but he had not been through any of the test pilot schools, and I had the assignment, and this is kind of interesting, I think, seriously interesting. We were flying P-80s, and I was testing an airplane that was in the research stage, and we had 3 of us on the thing, and we were now working toward breaking the sound barrier. Now, most people said, what in the world is the sound barrier? Well, it is a point, and it's a very technical thing, but I'm making it simple. Where the wings are attached to the fuselage on an airplane. When you get past 500 miles an hour, which is about 8/10 of a Mach number 1 is the speed of sound. That's what we couldn't achieve, and we tried it. I flew P-40s, flew P-51s first, and I got the P-51 up to about, a little over 8/10, which is 500 miles an hour. Starting out as high as you could climb, about 45,000. And with the P-47, the same thing. And the controls would stiffen up. It's called hysteresis. The forces of the wind would suck your elevators up, and you have a lot of wiring, and that's stretching, and it stretches, and suddenly the airplane has no control. You're sitting there, and the stick is in concrete until you slow down. So if you got over a certain speed, you had this. So that's why they called it a sound barrier, because that's hysteresis for the stretches of the cables, and then the air can do what it wants to. And if it sucks them up, which it does, and some of the tests I did with different airplanes, it sucks them up. Then the airplane pulls a P-40 or P-39 at about 400 miles an hour. You pitch up, because I had to do it with every type of airplane. And so there was the P-47. I used all the earlier airplanes that were not fast enough, but the P-51 and the P-47, I could actually get them to 500 miles an hour. And with 500 miles an hour on this airplane, I felt better in it, but it too would be stiff enough, and you aren't going anywhere. You're going in the direction you're pointed when you get up to 500 miles an hour. And so in my test program, there were 3 of us working on it, and the first one, we had a motor that was driving a piece of controls that were added on the tail. We were trying to break down this turbulence of airflow that kept you from going at the speed of sound. And what we did was we had an electric motor that drove a device we had put on the horizontal stabilizer back just where the elevators are at the hinge point. We put a flat plate. Said nobody knew had any they didn't have any research, but a flat plate about this wide that went span from the fuselage down to the tip. And to pull that up was like putting your flaps up. And what they wanted us to do was to go out to whatever Mach number we could get. And with the P-47, I felt better in it than I did in the other airplanes. And this final day came on. First pilot was killed. And he got killed when the canopy came off when he was in a dive. And it dished into the cockpit, and we found his head and his helmet about, I'd say, 2,000 feet away from the wreckage. And there were 3 of us on that program, and I was the junior person, the youngest also. And the other fellow and myself said, it's far more risky than we considered it to be. And engineering were trying to figure out what to do next. And I said, well, I suspect that electric motor didn't have enough power, and he couldn't get it to go to the different ratchets that you had to go to get the thing elevated to get through compressibility. And so I said, why don't you put a big motor on it? And so they put a big motor on it, and the second pilot lost the canopy, his head came off. Same thing, found the wreckage, found the head.
Did this give you pause about continuing this program?
My turn next, and I don't think I like this job. But I said, let's make that stick manual. And this is where the P-47 really comes in. I said, put a stick over here, just back of the throttle quadrant, that goes all the way to the floor. There's a big steel pipe like this. And put the controls, and instead of the motor, I want to physically have this go all the way up telescoping until I can get to the top of the canopy. If you look at the canopy, you can see how the shape is high here. And it goes back like this. And I had that to go all the way up. And I could reach up then. I've had my both shoulders broken, so I can't raise my arms. But I raised it as high as I could. And then I could pull a little thing I had, and I could make it go a notch at a time. And so I did a lot of flights before the bad one. And I got to get it going. And I thought I had it made. And I still got stuck at lower speeds. And so I kept working at it. And finally I got to where I could put it. And my chase pilot said, Bob, you've got to pull out of that dive. You're running out of altitude. I said, I've done everything I can, and I don't know if I'm going to make it or not. And so I finally got the ratchet to work. And it went to so many G's. And I looked at this airplane. The wings buckled right at the fuselage. See where the gear goes into the well? Where the gear goes into the well, that's what holds the landing gear on. And the airplane, I was at 0.83, and that was just slightly over 500 miles an hour vertical. And I was about 9,000 feet. And I heard the loud loudest noise I'd ever heard. Biggest explosion. I mean, it was just dynamite. And that's last thing I heard was this horrible noise. And I was unconscious. And 15 minutes later, I had the airplane trimmed just right when I went unconscious. I was unconscious because I pulled G's that were beyond human survival, actually. And nobody could figure out how I got away with it, but I guess I was stupid, and that must have been why. But
There's that word keeps coming up again.
I was pulling so hard on the stick, and when those wings buckled, it was a terrible explosion, and the gear doors came off and took half of the tail on one side. And when I came to, I'd been out. My chase pilot said, I heard my name called, and I was like this in the cockpit, and I didn't know what had happened. And I kept thinking I was hearing somebody calling my name, and I thought, where am I? And what's going on? And finally, I looked up, and I looked over, and I saw my chase plane there, just flying formation with me. And he said he'd been calling my name for 15 minutes before he saw any movement. And then he started talking to me and saying, you think you're okay? And I said, yeah. I said, I can't believe what I'm seeing. Oh, these wings were sticking up like this. And I didn't have too much left, it seemed to me, but it was flying, and all by itself. I wasn't on the controls. And so then I took over the controls, felt it out even with the tail, part of the tail missing. And he said, get out of it. He said, you can't land it. I said, I don't believe the gear hands stand up, and you could flip upside down, and that'll be the end of you. Why don't you bail out? And I said, see if the gear wiggles when I boot the rudder and skid it a little bit. That'll tell you whether it's locked in its locked position. And he said, well, the gear doors are gone. And I said, well, you can see the wheels. And he said, they don't seem to be moving. And I said, well, that's good enough for me. He said, but you could still have the gear pulled. I said, if the gear's down, I'm going to try to land it. There's no problem at all. It did land. I had to land hot, though, because I didn't have an elevator, but it worked out nicely, and I landed. And the airplane was totally destroyed. I mean, it was just a mess.
But you made it.
That's my horror story about the P-47. But it was a wonderful airplane in combat. It was right alongside the P-51.
Bob, I have one more question, but before I ask you that, remind everybody a couple of things. Bob will be over in the bookstore after. He won't sign books, they're pre-signed, but you'd be welcome to have a picture taken with Bob. That's in the bookstore after we've completed our program. And also, where's Kyle? There's Kyle over here waving her hand. We have challenge coins for any of you from Warbirds this year. Any of you would like a challenge coin? Just see Kyle after the program is over. Bob, last question. When you see the American flag all your life, what does that mean to you?
Shall I tell you a little short story about here? One year I was over by my airplane waiting for my turn to take off. And there were some cars parked by all of the performing airplanes. And I drove up in my car, and I was just waiting for my turn to fly. And the national anthem was teenagers next to a car, and another airplane that was one of the performers, and the national anthem was played and they didn't stand up. And I yelled, "On your feet!" And boy, it got a jump out of them. And they looked around where it come from. And I said, "You heard me?" And they stood on their feet. And when the national anthem was over, I walked over to them and I said, "Don't you know what that meant?" And the answer was, "I don't know." I said, "That's the American flag, the red, white, blue. That's what this country stands for." I said, "You're supposed to stand up. Think how many people have died trying to keep that flag flying." And these teenagers looked around like this. And I said, "Just believe me. We live in the greatest country in the world. And you've got to respect it. And you've got to pass that along to others. Stand at attention every time you hear that." And the end of the story is, I no more than got that out of my mouth, and I saw a giant stand up on the other side of the car, and it was the father of the two boys. And I thought, "Oh man, he's going to hammer me right in the top of the head." Well, believe it or not, he came over and shook hands with me. Happy ending. Thank you. Thank you all.
Ladies and gentlemen, Sam Bass and John Penny are going to do a walk around this airplane. If you want to learn more about the statistics about this B-47, thank you all very much. Bob Hoover. Thank you, sir.
Ladies and gentlemen, if I could, I'd like to restate what David said earlier. Mr. Hoover